So, for our third movement, as it were, the questions are, what is to be done? And where do we go from here? And given all of the many themes and tropes and topi that we've covered, to tie them together, I'm going to turn to Colonel Macgregor's recent book, Margin of Victory, and give a little excerpt just to tee things up. And as Doug says, when the tables turn as they did, referring to 5 battles that constitute the book, when the tables turn as they did, bad policies, failed tactics, and dysfunctional command structures have to be abandoned, period. Policymakers and commanders whose ideas were wrong must be discarded and replaced with new policymakers and new commanders, as well as new strategic and operational concepts. The first order questions in national military strategy have to be posed anew, within the strategic and operational framework of purpose, method, and end state. Yet, if culture and leadership obstruct this process of adaptation and change in war, the margin of victory is permanently lost. This is the nub of it, because as we discussed in the first movement, Russia has shown itself capable of adapting, capable of reaching back to historical antecedents, like the Brusilov offensive, like the entirety of the Great Patriotic War, and they have adapted in ways that Americans cannot bring themselves to understand. And in contrast, and I mean in stark 180-degree contrast, the United States military and its political leaders have not only not adapted, they've consistently extended and extruded a delusionary understanding of what is actually happening. And this is remarkable. And so in our last part, I want to turn to you, Colonel, and ask you what you would recommend to get us to change and adapt in a context where nothing over the last 60 years has achieved anything close to that.
Well, just to extend your opening comments somewhat, there is always a lag time between the identification of what has changed and its understanding. The Russians have obviously managed that more effectively, at least thus far. We'll see how this offensive unfolds.
Right.
If the offensive fails miserably and shows little evidence of what we think is going to happen, well, then we're wrong. But I don't think that's going to be the case. But having said that, it's very difficult to persuade people who have not grasped the shift in the way things are being done and the way things should be done. Sometimes that shift is cultural, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's economic. What can we actually afford versus what we want? And you don't get the necessary change. It's Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And the principal paradigm shift today, it goes back to the first part of our discussion. And that is that we can sit across from each other and know virtually everything about the other person, the other side. We can strike everything with a standoff attack system. And there's no way to hide from it. There are ways to defeat it.
Yeah.
Hiding from it is much more difficult. And so what you see, you can destroy. And of course, we had a taste of this in the 70s where people said, if you can see it, you can shoot at it.
Right.
If you can shoot at it, you can hit it. If you can hit it, you can destroy it. Okay, fine.
It killed you.
This was just a tank shooting at another tank or something. We're way beyond this at this point. And that paradigm shift is this ISR strike coupling. And we tend on the ground to think in terms of, well, we're the maneuver force and where we go is going to win the battle. Well, the problem today is that unless you have mastered the ISR strike dimension, you're never going to get there. You're never going to have a chance to maneuver. Your maneuver force is going to be destroyed, whether it's getting off the beachhead
Yeah.
or landing at the airstrip or anything else. And that's something that's very hard for people that have never seen it to grasp.
Just as a point of information here, are the ancient origins of this at all in the Soviet reconnaissance strike
Oh,
complex?
absolutely. That was the first serious intellectual attempt to come to terms with this reality. And of course, Ogarkov and one of his star performers was Mahmoud Gareev,
Yes.
who wrote very recently, when I say recently, 20 years ago, it all depends on your perspective, If War Comes Tomorrow. And he addresses all of these things in the Russian context. And
Right.
how do you cope? How do you adapt? And I think the Russians have come a long way. But remember, Putin initially was building a force that was designed to exclusively defend Russia.
Yeah.
Now he's compelled to do something different. He's compelled to build an offensive strike instrument with which to deter and potentially destroy opponents. This is the great gift that the blue elites that you're talking about have given to us. They've resuscitated the very thing they said they were setting out to stop.
But even here, as we've talked, Putin is at heart a cautious leader, commander. And, again, following after Montgomery and also what we see in Surovikin. But the fact is that he has to design an offensive weapon that doesn't overextend itself
Right.
and then expend itself in the effort.
Yeah. Well, he's more sensitive to that than we are.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Obviously, we are not even thinking intelligently about it, or we would not even consider something as utterly crazy as the coalition of the willing.
Right.
Unless the coalition of the willing is close to 1 million men and
Right.
consists of a very different composition from the forces we have today. So when you look at the U.S. military today, we have to ask the question, what are we and what do we want to do? Well, the first thing is that we have historically never been a land power on a global basis. In other words, we're really a land power only in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, we were an expeditionary power even at our height in World War II with 90 divisions deployed.
Of course. But the point is that we came out of that war with the delusion that we are a global land power.
That's right.
And we're not. And that we don't have the staying power to be a global land power. It's sort of the difference between an insular or a continental power and a maritime power. We're preeminently maritime and aerospace. And we have sufficient ground capability that we can deal with anything in our hemisphere. So we've got to get back to basics and understand that our ability to influence things is really confined more than ever in history to the periphery.
Yeah.
On the Eurasian periphery, we can influence things, but we cannot strike deep into the Eurasian landmass. I mean, it's essentially what Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, said. Anyone who talks about a war in Asia, a land war in Asia, should have his head examined. Well, thank you, Bob.
Well, we knew this.
What did you do to stop that?
We knew this in the 40s when Nicholas Spikeman was writing, for example.
But the thing is that we don't understand now with this ISR strike paradigm shift, the notion of occupying little islands all over the Pacific is a prescription for immediate strategic failure and destruction. Has no purpose whatsoever. And the notion that you can act with impunity the way we did in the past with large surface fleets, those days are over. And how many armies can we transport overseas?
Right.
I think those days are over.
Right.
So then what are we doing with all these regional unified commands? How many do we really need? Today, communications are vastly improved over what they were 40 or 50 years ago. When this regional unified command structure first came into existence, the first person to talk about it was Eisenhower. He wasn't able to implement it. It took failure under Jimmy Carter with the Air Force One and so forth to begin the movement in this direction,
Right.
get you Goldwater, Nichols, and everything else. But the bottom line is that things have changed since then. So you could conceivably have two regionally unified commands, east-west, and maybe two more north-south. And they could manage everything. And then you can treat your forces as a pool of forces that can be deployed on short notice in any direction, but only on a limited basis. In other words, not deploying 100,000 men to country X in Central Asia or down in South Africa.
Well, ironically, this was historically the British formula in the 18th century, but especially after the defeat of Napoleon, and it worked for 100 years, and then it all fell apart, and Britain found itself expending its national strength in two world wars.
Well, again, to go back to Corelli Barnett and others, he's not the only one. If you go back and look at the way they treated Bonaparte,
Right.
they ceased fire on Bonaparte several times. There were arrangements made for ceasefires, arrangements of new peace deals, because they understood this is a long-term process, and we're not going to accomplish everything within a short span of time. We know what Bonaparte's about, and we're going to continue to be opposed to him, but we have to look for and develop the situation that's favorable. We don't think in those terms because, once again, there's no long-term perspective. And that, I think, is because until now, we never really thought we needed it.
Yeah.
And as you've pointed out, when we have failed miserably, and I think you're right, since 1965, where's the evidence for success?
I know.
Well, Desert Storm. Well, fine, Desert Storm. What did Desert Storm do? For a short time, it convinced everyone in the world that we were invincible, invulnerable, and so forth. However,
But that was actually destructive.
yeah, it did not fundamentally change the strategic situation in the region because we didn't think about what we wanted when the war ended.
Well, gets back to this ecstatic realization. It was like a perfect grand opera because we
Yes.
suffered almost no casualties.
Right.
And then it all went up in smoke within 3 or 4 years.
And we celebrated ourselves and went home.
Yeah.
And the generals were happy to have it over with because they really didn't want to fight to begin with. And they were afraid that nothing would work right because these were largely traumatized Vietnam veterans.
That's
And the
right.
various services fought their own wars. And when it's over, there was no effort to deal with the service-centric warfighting doctrines. There was no effort to produce true unity of effort, no effort to create unified military command structures. So everybody says, well, we don't want a unified structure. Well, that's different. People can keep uniforms and funny hats and so forth. I mean, it reminds me of the British Army when they began the process of reducing the numbers of Highland regiments.
Oh yes, that was
know.
bitter and
Oh
difficult.
my God, people went out of their minds. And here's this tiny place called Scotland trying to fill the ranks.
What to do with the regimental silver?
Yeah, they couldn't do it anymore. They've survived it, okay? It hasn't been a hopeless endeavor. We'll survive what we have to do.
Well, what it does need to be done. If you were in a position, of Godhead, and you could impose reforms, if you could at least lay out reforms that had to be pursued and achieved, what would those be?
Well, the first thing you want to do is stop refighting World War II. I mean, we talk about it, but we never do it.
Right.
It means that you've got to treat the 1942 force structure as something to be broken and reassembled in a new form. Then you start at the top and work your way down. You have in a unified command the theater commander, which is effectively what he is. And he has this joint staff.
Right.
But beneath him, he has all these single service headquarters. We can't afford them. They're too expensive. There are too many of them. We need to get rid of them. And we need to restructure those into standing joint force commands. And I would organize these around ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment. We still think of war essentially in a Clausewitzian or Geminian fashion.
Yeah.
And this G1, G2, G3, G4, G5 business, all of that can be folded into a new structure that is ISR, strike,
Yeah.
maneuver, and sustainment.
Right.
Because that's the way the naval forces
That's
and the
true.
air forces are effectively organized. And we are preeminently aerospace and naval power. So really you're talking about taking what is already experiential
Yeah.
and embedded in the thinking in the aerospace and naval community and pushing it into the ground force. Then you turn around and say, well, what are the new force, the mission force capability packages look like?
Right.
Focused, excuse me. In other words, what are the units of issue that we're going to use? If you go to the Army today, well, we want X, Y, and Z. Here's a division. By the way, it has to have a core slice and a core headquarters. It's jobs for generals.
Yeah, of course.
So if you want us, we have to ship all our generals over there to do this job for you. And we're not going to be subordinate to somebody in the Marines or the Navy or the Air. That's out of the question. You've got to get past all this. So then you set up these joint force headquarters that are designed to take in these modules of combat power, whatever they are, and employ them productively. You may end up supporting someone else who's fighting on the Eurasian landmass, not necessarily your own forces.
Right.
A page out of the British Empire.
Right.
In other words, Wellington's force, out of his entire force, what, a third of them were British? And
Yeah.
the rest were Germans,
Belgians.
some Dutch and Belgians, right?
Westphalians.
It worked.
It did.
It worked effectively. The British were smart. They weren't going to expend resources they didn't have. And they came out of this thing, on the profit side as opposed to the losing side of the margin.
Yes, that's true.
But the bottom line is we can do these things. We can set up these joint force commands. We can put them under the theater command. We can determine what needs to go into them. And then we can experiment with the right mission-focused capability packages, whatever that is. I suggested on the ground that you have a one-star who commands between 5,000 and 6,000 troops, all organized around ISR strike maneuver sustainment. That's a good place to start.
Yeah.
But the problem is when you talk to the people in the military and you say, you might consider doing this and this and this, they'll say, well, prove to me in advance, before I do that, this will work,
Absolutely.
because we know this worked in 1945.
Yeah.
Well, how well did it work in 1969? How well did it work? Oh, well, look at 1991. Well, the truth is we weren't faced with a very capable or determined enemy either. Certainly not on the scale of the Waffen-SS or the Imperial Japanese Army. But no one wants to go there. In other words, the burden of proof, I think it was this person that's over at Brookings, his name escapes me right now, who writes all military affairs all the time, who wrote in 1997, the burden of proof is on Macgregor that anything has to change.
Yeah.
We were so successful.
Non-falsifying.
It's
You
a
see the
lot of
same thing in
nonsense.
Science. Well, listen, I mean, Americans like to do a little, rosary prayer, and they like to always say, I'm an optimist. And so I'll say, for the first time in my life, I'm an optimist because I believe, given the kind of dimensionality and direction of what you've just described, that this sort of reform could be done
Yes.
with someone with a vision and authority to do it. It could be done. Then, however, there is something I'm not optimistic about, and it has been at the, if you will, spiritual knowledge core of our predicament for the last 60 years, and that is the ability to do real net assessment. This is something that I can't find a way out of, not because I can't personally do it, but having been in an institution that talked about the necessity of it and yet never engaged in it and refused to take the steps of cultural receptivity, empathy, all the rest that would allow you to do it, has led me to believe that it simply can't happen within the very ironclad contours of the American ethos, which we know. In American exceptionalism, again, if you're the divine agent of the Almighty, then what you believe about yourself is ground truth.
Well, the last president, and this is an interesting point on presidents in general.
Yeah,
Presidents all come to office with experience in domestic politics.
right.
Some may have some appreciation or understanding of economics or not. But there are two other categories about which they know almost nothing. One is military affairs or defense,
Right.
and the other is foreign affairs.
Right.
That's the problem. Now, the last man who came in, who knew nothing about domestic politics at all, but did have an understanding of military affairs, foreign affairs, and some understanding of economics, was Eisenhower.
Right. That is true.
And if you go back to the 50s and look what he does, he's constantly scaling back on expenditures, canceling programs, throwing people out of his office who come in with dumb ideas. Even McNamara, who normally everyone enjoys pulverizing,
Right.
and with good reason, he had the common sense to tell a group of Army generals, they came into his office and said, well, we need, whatever it was, 32 divisions to deter and defeat the Soviet armed forces. This is before Vietnam.
Yeah.
He said, really? He said, well, how many ships and aircraft do you have to move the equipment and manpower for these 32 divisions? Yeah.
Yeah.
And ultimately they come back and say, well, we only have the ships and aircraft to move 18 or 20, whatever it was. He said, well, then that's what you're going to get, 20 divisions.
Yeah.
Don't come in here again and push stupid ideas.
That's what the Ford Motor Company chair would say.
Yeah, but that's a good thing, and you got to give him credit for that. The problem is we haven't had any of it for decades.
Right.
There's been no accountability. Now there is accountability, and that unfortunately tends to focus largely on who you slept with that you shouldn't have.
Right.
Which is something which would have been completely foreign and alien to John Pershing
Right.
or George Patton or any
Right.
number of it. What?
Yeah.
Not that these were immoral men, but there's this disproportionate focus on things that don't count,
Right.
and no focus on the things that do, and a failure to understand that all people are flawed, and we have to accept the fact that human beings are flawed. But what do you want them to do? And this is back to, who are we as a nation? What do we want to do as a nation?
Yeah.
Do we want to be an English-speaking country with a free market that trades with everybody and tries to avoid wars and really doesn't want to fight with anybody, but will defend our interests and will defend our population, our citizens, with all at our disposal? Or do we want to be the global hegemon?
See, the last time that vision was in the ascendant was when Washington delivered the farewell address. Then maybe a few years after the Civil War, but you're making me less optimistic here because Eisenhower was a unique product of a war.
Yes.
And that speaks volumes for him personally. But what I'm missing is how to get the people that we need to lead us get to that level of insight about themselves and America in terms of what needs to be done. And let's look at this from a different angle. The Soviets are constantly, I slipped, I knew I would eventually. The Russians, throughout their history, have had a military narrative of endless travail, but ultimate victory. And those grave defeats that they've suffered have all served them well, because it took the defeat to create the awakening, to create the necessity. And all of America's defeats after World War II, and I would say since the mid-60s, have not required any reckoning and have all been written off as overhead and then actually forgotten. So the big question here, and it's not something that either of us or anyone could answer, is would such a grand shock to the leadership of the U.S., its elites, courtiers, and the military, be enough to break all of the, crenellated castle of prejudice that sits like a rock on the imperial city? Could it happen? Because that could be about what's to happen if certain things unfold the way we've discussed. But would such a blow begin to move the rock?
Well, remember, Clausewitz talked about two kinds of wars: a war of decision,
Yeah.
which involved existential questions for the nation state, and what he called wars of observation, which I normally refer to as low-intensity conflicts or lesser contingencies.
Right.
We've been involved in lesser contingencies, low-intensity conflicts, frankly. Now we're dealing with Ukraine, and what we don't understand is that for Russia, this is an existential conflict. It is now a war of decision. Didn't begin as that because the Russians didn't anticipate it, but now they've got it, and they understand it, and they're going to fight it as a war of decision.
The closest we came to an existential war was, of course, the Civil War.
Yes.
And you could say the first year or so of the American Revolution.
Well, you could also argue, and I'm not saying this is factual, but you could argue that World War II, did raise questions about, the nation and its existence, and it was, quote unquote, a war of decision.
Yes, it was indeed.
Yeah. So we haven't had a war of decision since 1945.
No, and the kind of afterglow of World War II that I think served as a counterbalance or countervailing force to the super sense of transcendence, gods of war that came out of that experience was the nuclear dimension. And it stayed our hand for decades. But this was arguably, or at least I'll suggest it, the most pernicious consequence of the fall of the Soviet Union was it took away that countervailing force that was effectively the existential hand staying our course.
Well, obviously, Putin agrees with you, and he's made these statements repeatedly.
Well, we
I-
can't get in touch with the existential anymore.
Yeah, but well, that's true. But the existential questions are not overseas; they're here at home.
Yes, that's right.
And that's where we're headed. But in the meantime, I think we have another problem that you haven't really touched on, and that is where do we draw the talent from that governs us? Well, where are the institutions that produce this sort of special breed of people? Well, historically, we turn to the Ivy Leagues
Right.
and the service academies. But if we look at the faculties and the teaching in the Ivy Leagues or the service academies right now, that's a frightening prospect.
Well, let's touch on this just briefly then, because you were close to and advised the last president, and in effect, whatever opinions you hold of him, he did represent a mass of Americans who are increasingly being ignored and made marginal in political life. So you ask, where do we get our leaders? We've traditionally got them from elites, but they were elites who were often local elites. Sure, a lot of them came from the Ivy League, went to the State Department, but in terms of running the country, there was still that elite connected to people locally, communities.
You mean Sam Rayburn from Texas,
Yeah, something like that.
who had cousins in Tennessee, right?
But it was a network, it was a mesh. And now increasingly you have these separate, mostly blue and some red elite communities that essentially own the process from start to finish. They own the universities, they own the media, they own all of the nonprofits that are so important, and they have the money, and they have the two parties and the organization and structure and institutional authority of the two parties. So they're building what amounts to a hermetic, separate political system, something far less sensitive to the people even than a British society in the mid-18th century, which no one would argue was a democracy. But that elite still had capacity for social upward mobility, and it still had it took the pulse of people. Now increasingly you have a stern and an unforgiving, what Orwell would call the inner party, and the outer party. They are the thing that owns our political system. And so you ask the question, where do we get our leaders? That leads you back to the conundrum that I posed about ever being able to see things, because the entire prime directive of this elite is to preserve and extend its power and control. And it is engaged in doing that. We saw that during the pandemic, and we see it now in the conduct of the war, which is a wholly owned franchise of the Washington elite. And so I worry about this, and you're totally right when you say that the war of decision is at home, because you can't permanently marginalize and reduce to a kind of serfdom the majority of Americans, and I include there all of the blue constituencies who have essentially been marginalized already as well.
Yes.
They form the majority of Americans, and there is no pathway for the voice of this majority to be heard in America today.
Unless the current elites are replaced by a different elite
Right, and that's
that emerges from a different milieu.
that's right.
And that's all tied up with what happens next.
That's the revolution.
Yeah, and well, it's also what happens when this narrative for Ukraine collapses.
Yeah, and
That's part of it.
this is a great sort of final point for us to make, and you've raised that really nicely, is that the connection between the domestic conflict and the foreign conflict is indissoluble. And just as has happened so many times, the foreign conflict can prise open, turn over the barrel, and let it all spill out. So
I think that's where we're headed.